And again, just jump in if you have any questions. Okay, can everyone see this? Can someone give me like a thumbs up emoji or something?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, cool. So we'll start with the readings from week 1. We'll start with the Zeitlin reading. So there are 2 chapters here, the philosophical origins of Karl Marx. So chapter 13, the first one, talks about Marx's work on alienation. And so what I've done here is you'll see for all the slides, I've picked out like points of the reading, and I'm just going to explain them. Marx thus condemned the capitalist system for its effect on individual human beings. So in this reading, Zeitlin's basically introducing Marx and what Marx thought of capitalism and alienation within capitalism. And so he's saying, Marx despised capitalism. He really did not like it. He thought that it, destroyed relationships amongst people, destroyed people, is dehumanizing, it was exploitative. So Marx really did not like capitalism, which hopefully you know at this point. Instead of developing his essential human powers, man was being debased and deformed, and thus becoming something less than an animal, right? So for Marx, all people and all humans were special. We were all, we all are creative. We have the capacity to be creative and to, work in a productive way that is meaningful to us and who we are as people. Our species being, right? Our species essence, sometimes it's called. And Marx is saying, capitalism completely destroys that, right? It gets rid of our species being. We are unable to live and work in a society in a way that is meaningful to us. And this dehumanization, as he calls it, right, is a consequence of alienation, which we'll get into when we cover the Marx reading next. But so that's essentially this. Chapter 13 is just him explaining the background of Marx. Chapter 14, a lot of people had questions on this one, so we're going over it twice. So there's another slide that will talk about it in more detail. But this is basically on Zeitlin talking about Marx's view about human history. Okay, so how did Marx view the development of society over time? And Marx has this thing called the materialist conception of history. Okay, sometimes you'll see dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and basically Marx was, and this is again coming from Zeitlin, Marx was writing at a time when previous philosophy, there's this guy, Hegel, this group of people that followed him, the young Hegelians, and this world of philosophy was largely arguing that the development of human history and changes in society is a result of, it's a top-down process, okay? So our ideology, our religion, our beliefs in general, whatever, our consciousness, right, is going to then determine how we function as a society, okay? So our consciousness is going to determine our existence, our economy, our production, etc. And that's the Hegelian view, okay? So that's what Marx is arguing against. And so for Marx, obviously, then it's the opposite, right? And this is what we talked about a little bit in class. For Marx, it's a bottom-up approach, okay? So for Marx, our existence, our mode of production, our economy, our base, right, is going to influence everything up above. It's going to influence our ideology, our religion, our art, our education, everything else, our consciousness, okay? So for Marx, our existence determines our consciousness. And he's arguing against this guy named Hegel. Does this make sense? Okay, I'm just going to keep going. Yeah, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just ask.
Sorry, I meant to put a thumbs up.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Allie. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Okay, so then we have the manuscripts, right? And this is what, hopefully you guys are more familiar with this, because this is what you wrote the papers about. And so this obviously talks about Marx's idea of alienation. So first sentence, I think, or one of the first sentences, he says, "We have started out from the premises of political economy." Okay, so in this paper, Marx is largely arguing against this, classical theoretical school called classical political economy. Okay, and this is more if you think of like Adam Smith or like, if you think of like econ today, how economists see society, right? So Marx is arguing totally against that. And we've talked about this a bit, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we have these four ways that people are alienated under capitalism that Marx discusses, right? They're alienated from the product. They never see the final product that they're making. They're alienated from the labor process, okay? From themselves, one's like their own species essence, species being, and they're alienated from others. And what's an important point here to reiterate that I think, a handful of you had asked about this when meeting with me about your paper, is that this particular piece of Marx is very, very abstract, okay? So this is early Marx. So when he wrote this, he had never seen a factory. He'd never been to a factory. He'd never seen, a production line, machines like that, anything. He hadn't seen any of this. So none of this writing was based in like actual scientific evidence or sociological research. It was just like his ideas, right? So it's super vague. It's super abstract. And nonetheless, it is important, right? It's an important, we can draw from it and make important points, and we can see, labor is alienating. He makes a good point there, but important to remember is it's very vague. It's important and it's interesting to read, but it's not like totally complete and scientific. Okay, that's week one. Any questions week one? Okay, awesome. Week two. So week two, we didn't actually have section because it was the holiday, so this is the first time I'm going to go over this. So if you guys have questions, please ask them. So the Hobsbawm reading, this is basically an introduction. It is giving background on the Communist Manifesto, when it was made, why it was made, who it was made for. So Hobsbawm basically goes on and he's saying, the manifesto conquered the world. It had this huge influence in society, really, really important. And so many people read it during this time. It had become a political classic, right? And this is in large part because it was very digestible, right? Like I have a copy, so I was showing the last class. Like it's very skinny, it's very small. It's not very long. It was easy to read. And so it became very famous very quickly. It spread fast. And that's not to say, that it doesn't have its faults. And so Hobsbawm recognizes, it's clear that the manifesto was written for a particular historical situation, right? So Marx wrote this during an important time in European history, during the revolutions of 1848. Okay, so in 1848, in Europe, we saw waves of revolutions happening all across everywhere, okay? So Marx was very inspired by this, and that's what drove him to eventually write this manifesto. So it was written during that time, but it was also, as Hobsbawm recognizes, pretty an immature phase of his thought, right? So again, this is known as early Marx, so he hadn't really gone and done any research. This is just like his ideas. He was like, what would society... what is society going to look like years from now when we advance through capitalism, and what will become of it? And so, and he didn't get everything right? So one of the important things that he predicts in this book, which we'll talk about in the next slide, is, the proletariat alone is a revolutionary class whose inevitable destiny is to overthrow the bourgeoisie, right? So Marx predicted over time, the proletariat class would realize their common exploitation, come together, and overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then eventually go on and implement a communist society, right? So that obviously, we haven't seen that materialize in history yet. So that's something that Marx predicted that didn't necessarily come true. And so Hobsbawm is basically saying, even though he wrote this and it's not, a fact of history, right? He didn't get everything right. It's still a really important piece of writing, okay? So that's the main takeaway from this reading. And then we'll go to the actual reading. So Marx is writing this, like I said, right, during the time of the 1848 revolutions. And so he's being very dramatic, right? This is haunting Europe. Communism is coming. We see it happening and it's going to come. And he says, the history of all existing society is the history of class struggle. So for Marx, we see the separation of classes in all stages of human history. So we have, slave and slave owner, serf and lord. Now we have proletariat and bourgeoisie, right? So all of human history is driven by class struggle. So we move forward and we develop in history because we constantly have two classes clashing with each other. And so now we are in, industrial capitalism. And so we have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, these two different classes. And so if you remember, the bourgeoisie are not just like the rich people. It's not just about money. It's about owning the means of production. Okay. So the bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production, which means that they own the factories, they own the raw materials to produce things, right? So that's why that's the bourgeoisie. That's that definition, okay? And the proletariat do not own anything but their own labor. So they don't own any means of production, anything like that. All they own is themselves, and they can sell themselves for labor, right? They're free to sell their labor. And they're the working class, right? So that's the difference between those two classes. And so the bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat. There we go. And so then Marx goes on to talk about capitalism, and how he sees capitalism as this almost like infectious disease, right? It's eventually going to, seep into everything. It's going to spread across the whole globe. And he sees it as this like violent, its development was very violent, and it's a violent ongoing process. And he thought it was going to spread everywhere. Okay. This last part doesn't matter. So we're going to skip through. And so Marx, like we were talking about earlier, right, had this idea that the proletariat was supposed to be this like very, very important class in driving human history. Okay. He saw it as a revolutionary class. Their ultimate aim was to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie and implement socialism and then communism. Okay. And so then he spent some time later on in the reading explaining like, okay, what will a communist society actually look like? And I put here, I don't have much time to go into so much detail, but it's on page 20 and 21 of the PDF that the professor posted. If you want to look at the specifics of like what he's saying communism would look like, I would recommend just reading over the main points really quickly. But, we see things like the abolishing private property, right? So, I mean, that's not like your toothbrush, that's your personal property, but private property is in like the factories that are owned by one person, right, will suddenly be owned by everyone collectively. He talks about, free healthcare and education and all these other things. So I would recommend just briefly looking those over. But yeah. And okay, any questions on the manifesto? Okay. So this is another one. This is what I said we would get back to. People had a lot of trouble with this one, which is fair because it's confusing. So this site with reading, and this is important, I will say, this talks about Marx and his ideas about human history. And we've seen these words a lot: economic, technological determinism. Okay, so this is one of the first sentences, I think, if not the first sentence in the chapter. Marx died in 1883. Soon after, Marxism came to stand for a theory in which economic and other material factors explained the structure of society and the course of history. Okay, and so this is what I was saying earlier, right? For Marx, our base determines our superstructure, right? Our economy is going to determine our consciousness or ideology, whatever, right? And that's what Marx has come to be known for, okay? So people they read his work and they say, yeah, that's what he's known for. For Marx, the only thing that matters is the economy. The only thing if that's economic determinism, okay, that's what economic determinism means, that the economy determines everything else. And people also have largely said that Marx was a technological determinist. So this right here, right, that changes in some important element of production would determine the movement of history too. So instead of having an axe, going from having an axe to having a machine that chops wood is also going to drive human history. That's technological determinism, okay? And so Zeitlin's reading is basically saying, here are all these people who say that Marx is an economic determinist. They say he's a technological determinist, and I'm going to show you why he is not, okay? So Zeitlin does not believe that Marx is an economic or technological determinist. And so he spends this reading basically giving examples of how that is wrong. And so he pulls through different readings from Marx or different letters from Engels and Marx and all these things to show ultimately that while Marx believed that the economy was perhaps the most important thing, it's not the only thing, right? So it's not that the economic condition is the cause and alone active, right? It's not that it's the only thing, but it does ultimately always assert itself. So it is very important, but it's not the only thing. So Zeitlin is saying people have thought that he's an economic determinist, but he's not. Does that make sense? I know people struggle with this. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and then the other part of the reading is similar. So people have also said that Marx is an evolutionist. And this is because he has a very clear layout of how he sees societies develop over time, right? So he says, societies start mostly as tribal, and then they transform into slave, and then they transform into feudal, and then eventually we end up and we have a capitalist society, okay? And so some people, because Marx outlines these stages very clearly, they say that he's an evolutionist, okay? And again, Zeitlin is saying, no, you guys are reading it wrong. You're not really understanding what he's saying. He's not an evolutionist, right? It's more of a metaphor. Marx knows that, history is not one straight line, but he uses it for the ease of explaining things. So the Zeitlin reading is basically saying, here are these three things that people commonly attribute to Marx: economic and technological determinism and evolutionism. And Zeitlin is saying they are not true. Okay? Okay. Any questions week 2? Okay, week 3. Okay, commodity fetishism. So hopefully, I think we went over this for a while in class, so hopefully this is not as confusing. But commodity fetishism is basically this idea that, let me back up. So for Marx, the economy is not just something that is embedded in social relations. Social relations are not just embedded in the economy or in economic relations. They're the same thing. So economic relations are social relations for Marx, and social relations are economic relations. They're one and the same, okay? And this is what he believed, and he said that under, modern day capitalism, this relationship is obscured. So when I go and I buy, like I used this example in my last class, I was blanking on my lap because it's freezing and raining. I went and I bought this blanket from Target, and I have no idea where Target got it, right? I have no idea where it came from, where they shipped it from. I don't know who planted the seeds to grow the stuff needed to make the yarn or the fabric, and who knit it together, who sewed it, right? I don't know any of that. To me, this blanket is fetishized, right? And remember, that just means like magical or has use, right? I like this blanket, and this blanket has value to me because it keeps me warm. And that's what I see. That's the only thing that I see when I go to buy it at the store. And Marx explains, no, what gives the blanket value is the fact that human labor went into making it, okay? What makes something valuable is the fact that it was made by humans, right? There's a social relationship behind all commodities on the market that we just do not see because of capitalism, right? So when I see, my phone, I just see it as a phone that's going to help me get in contact with people or whatever, waste time on Instagram. I don't think of it and think of all the hundreds of people that went into making the phone, right? I don't think of it as a social thing. I just think about it as it's useful. And Marx is saying we have to recognize the social nature that's inherent in our economic relations. Okay, remember, these things go hand in hand together. Does that make sense to everyone? Because that's a little confusing also. Okay, cool. And so then he outlines these two different things, right? We have two different kinds of value and two different kinds of labor. So we have use value and exchange value. Use value is just simply what makes something useful, right? The blanket has use value because it keeps me warm. And exchange value is how we exchange it on the market. So in this case, we could think about price. I don't know, let's say it was like $30, okay? And so we have these two different kinds of value, right? And then we have these two different kinds of labor. We have abstract and concrete labor. So abstract labor produces exchange values, okay? I will repeat this again. Abstract labor produces exchange values. And all this means is that in all commodities, right? Because something can only become a commodity when it's produced for market exchange. If I knit this blanket just for me to use it myself, it would not have an exchange value because I'm not exchanging it. It would still have a use value, but it would not have an exchange value because I'm not exchanging it on the market, okay? Anyway, so abstract labor produces exchange values, and it's just the general idea that human labor went into making something, okay? It's abstract. It's not looking at something in specific. Human labor went into making it, and concrete labor is the opposite. So concrete labor produces use values. Okay, it produces use values. It is specific. It is very specific. So concrete labor would be like me hammering a nail into a table to make the table, right? I'm doing something specific that is creating a table that will have use. And that's the difference between those. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. Then we have primitive accumulation. Yeah, primitive accumulation. And so in these chapters, Marx is basically saying, here we are in our present day, and we're living in this society of industrial capitalism where we have, exploiters, the bourgeoisie, and they exploited the proletariat. And how did we get here, right? When did this first start? When did the accumulation of capital and of surplus value of profit first start? So primitive just means original. Okay, it doesn't mean like, I don't know, barbaric or whatever. It just means original. The first time that this happened, okay? The first time that we accumulated capital. And he looks far, far back in human history, and he talks about, colonialism and colonial expansion, slavery, stuff like that, looking back. And so he sees primitive accumulation as this very, very violent process, right? These are not things that came peacefully. It didn't come easily. It was very violent. And he explains how today we have, free laborers in the double sense. So people are free in modern day capitalism in two ways. One, because they are free, themselves. They are not slaves, right? They are free to sell their own labor. And two, they're free of owning the means of production. So he's talking specifically about the proletariat here, right? The proletariat are free because they are free to sell their own labor, and they are free because they do not own any of the means of production. Okay, so that's like this dual sense of freedom, I guess. And Marx then goes back into history and explains, okay, why is this important, right? How did we get to this point? How do we get to modern day capitalism? And he explains this through his theory of primitive accumulation, right? He says three things are necessary to develop it and to advance to where we are today, okay? One, people, the producers, need to be dispossessed or removed from their land, right? If I own a farm and I can grow all my food for myself that I need to survive, why would I go and work for like Stephanie or work for Allison or work for whoever for a wage that's like gonna pay me nothing? Like, why would I go work for someone else when I just could make the stuff my own? So the first thing that needs to happen is people need to have their land taken away from them, because if I don't have land, then I am forced to go work for someone else, right? The second thing that will happen is the concentration of wealth at the top. Okay, so, this is the classic, like the rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer, and eventually, all the wealth will be at the top. And then the third thing Marx explains is you need to have a very specific set of social conditions for this to happen, right? So it's the context in which this is all happening is very specific to the time that it's happening. So it will look different. Primitive accumulation, or not primitive, but just accumulation, capital accumulation will look different in a slave society, in a feudal society, right? It's going to look different. So a specific set of social conditions, the concentration of wealth and land dispossession. Okay, these are three really important things. And again, he says, this is a very violent process. It originated very violently, and it was not easy. Okay, any questions, week 3?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So for abstract and concrete labor, I know you mentioned that concrete labor is specific. So does that mean abstract labor varies and it's more broad?
So concrete labor is specific just because it's talking about like a very specific action, right? So like, because it produces a use value. So like, let's say this mug, right? My concrete labor is, if I made this mug, was like going into the ceramic studio and like shaping the mug. I've never done this, so I don't know how you do it, but like making it, that's concrete. It's very specific what I'm doing. It's like actual labor that I can watch. You can come and watch me make it, right? Abstract labor is just the general idea of human labor. So like, instead of, talking, oh, I made this, whatever, you saw me make this cup, it's just the idea that like, here's this mug and a human made this mug, right? It's not any specific kind of labor. It's just the general proposition that, all commodities are made by humans, right? General human labor is inherent in commodities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay, then we'll do week 4. This is good. I'm much faster than my last class, so you guys are lucky you don't have to be the guinea pig. So I'll do this super quick, and then we'll have a decent amount of time for your questions at the end. Okay, so Marx in the Civil War. Okay, so for Marx, in this reading, he's explaining how in Britain at the time, most of the newspapers and most of the people saw the Civil War in the U.S. as a tariff war, right? It was just about taxes, that's it, blah, blah, blah. And Marx was saying, nope, that's not what this is about at all. He saw the Civil War as a social revolution, and we'll get into that in the next slide more. And so remember, we had the discussion question from class, right? Why did the South need to expand and get new territories? And for Marx, he explains, this is because the South needed to maintain power in Congress, right? As the populations of free states grow far more quickly than those of slave states. So as the North is growing much faster than the South, the South was like, oh no, we need to, we also need to grow. We need to expand. We need to get more slave states so that we can have more power in Congress. And so that we can eventually, our system can take over. So Marx, that's why he thought, or he talked about the need for the South to expand. And so that being said, for him, the Civil War was not about defense. It was not about taxes. It was not about anything like that. It was a war of conquest for the spread and perpetuation of slavery. So Marx saw the U.S. Civil War as a competition, between the economic system in the North, right, which is a capitalist system, okay, and an economic system of the South, which was a system of slavery, okay? So he saw it was a competition between these two social systems, and he saw it as a social revolution, right? Because the North would, eventually go on and win, and capitalism would then succeed, and slavery would end and spread, and yada yada. And so Marx saw it as a social revolution. Yeah. And okay, and then Du Bois reading. So like we just said, hopefully you guys remember this a little more because we just talked about it. But the usual way that people explain the end of the Civil War is Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Du Bois is saying, no, that's not right. And this chapter in his book is basically explaining how enslaved folks during the Civil War sort of took back their power, used their agency, were more autonomous than we give them credit, and what they did to help end the war, right? So the South, the Southern economy was like almost entirely reliant on cotton, right? Cash crop cotton. And slaves. Their entire labor force was made up of slaves. And so without the slaves there to, work the fields, do whatever, they were told to do, the Southern economy, like, totally diminished. And so, Du Bois is recognizing the different ways in which enslaved people sort of organized around this during the war and fought back against the South, right? So, some of the ways they escaped their plantations. They went to the North. They worked and fought in Northern armies. They withheld their labor, right? They had this general strike. And so this totally, really destroyed the Southern economy. And that's how Du Bois sees the end of the war, right? He's saying, it wasn't just Lincoln. It was the fact that millions of people, or half a million it says here, but all of these people, came together and fought against the South. All these enslaved people fought against the South for their own freedom and autonomy. And so the takeaways from this week are, I think, in lecture, he says something about how some people call this like the second American Revolution or something. And that's just talking about the fact that, this was a social revolution. It was a social revolution. It wasn't just a war. It was Marx saw it, and Du Bois as well saw it as this like social revolution between these two classes. And so they're like, oh, this way of phrasing it is helps us remind us that, that's what it is and not like just about taxes. Okay, I think that's it. I had initially did this, and then you guys could like scan it and type your questions, but I think we're just gonna open the floor to asking questions. So at this point, first, if you guys could please turn your cameras on. If you're able, it would just make it so much better for everybody. And thank you